When I was young, my family visited my father's mother, my paternal grandmother, and I came too because I was too young to be left on my own. And in the course of the conversation between my father and his mother, my grandmother, who was quite old, very old at that time, said something about her presumably approaching death to the effect that dying was setting out on a great journey. And that statement has stuck with me ever since. I believe that the reason that it stuck with me is that it is the only time that I can recall that a person has spoken about life after death in the way that people would speak about life after death if it was a settled fact in their minds. I have certainly heard many people claim a belief in life after death, whether that be a basically Christian model where you go to a particular afterlife permanently, or whether it be a Buddhist or Hindu type of model where you are born again. And yet I've never heard, well, I've heard only once someone speak about life after death as a settled fact. Well, when I die, this thing will happen, of course. And that makes me suspicious. I hear people talk about the existence of the United States of America, for example, as settled fact all the time. People say, I'm planning to go on holiday to Los Angeles, and when I go there, I think I might go to Hollywood because I'm interested in films, or etc., etc. Lots of statements which take the existence of the United States for granted. I've never heard anyone say, I believe in the United States of America, in the sense of, I believe that the United States of America exists. I have heard people say, I believe in the United States of America in some sort of political sense, meaning that I believe in the promise of the United States of America, or I believe in the potential of the United States of America, something like that. But I've never heard anyone say, well, I think the US exists. A person once said to me, I am more certain that God exists than that I am standing here. If I heard people say stuff like that, I am firmly convinced that the United States is a real place, and yet I never heard anyone say, well, you know, in America, ... If nobody ever said that, but everyone very firmly said, I believe the United States of America is a real place, I think that would sort of make me wonder, well, do you believe in the United States? Do you really believe that it exists? And are you just telling me what you believe? Or are you trying to quiet doubts that you yourself have? Are you telling yourself that the United States exists rather than actually believing it? Are you worried that you don't believe that the United States exists? Do you have some sort of belief that lack of belief in the United States puts you in peril? And are you trying to damp down that sense of doubt rather than simply telling me a thing that you believe? And so, of course, analogously, I suspect that the religious are not, I'm not going to say that they're lying. I don't think that that's fair, because apart from anything else, why would you lie? If you didn't believe that God existed, most people would probably just prefer to just tell the truth, at least when they were dealing with me, a person who is obviously not going to judge them for not being a Christian, or I'm not going to harass them or, you know, cut them out of my life if they express doubts about religion. I don't think they're consciously lying, but I think maybe they're lying to themselves, perhaps would be a way to describe it, or they're treating the doubts that they have as if they don't count, and sort of making an effort to believe more than actually believing. And of course, I can't prove that, because the people who say they believe in God are going to say they believe in God. And you might find an atheist who used to be a Christian, and that atheist would say, well, I used to say that I believed in God, but really in my heart I knew that I had doubts. Of course, other Christians might say, yeah, but we didn't have doubts. You lacked faith. It's just you. You're not revealing a thing that all Christians have in their hearts but don't talk about. You're just saying a thing that was true of you because you are less imbued with the virtue of faith. And of course, that's why you've ended up an atheist. So I don't think there's any way that we could ever, we being people who are outsiders to religion. I don't think we can ever really know, but I think we can say, well, if they did unproblematically believe, they would speak in particular ways, and if they had doubts, they would speak in other ways, and they very consistently speak in the ways that we would expect if they have doubts, to the point where the one time somebody spoke in a different way, it stayed with me for decades. But I don't think we can know. I think we can, conclude on balance, perhaps, that this is the case. But I don't think we can ever really know. The point of this, to me anyway, is that one of the arguments for religion is, well, look, if you believe and there isn't a life after death, you'll never know. And you'll live a life free from the fear of death, and you'll die sort of sure of a reward. And yeah, that reward won't happen, but you'll have had a much better life than you would have had if you were constantly aware of approaching nothingness and sort of afraid of death. So why not believe? And that, of course, it isn't an intellectual argument. It isn't a reason to conclude intellectually that life after death is the case, but it is a pretty good practical argument. It is a fairly convincing argument, at least to me, who does feel the fear of death and does think about death and doesn't like the fact that they will die and cease to exist. There may be other atheists who don't fear death. I don't know. I suspect actually that there are a lot of atheists who are doing a similar thing to what the Christians are doing, i.e. the atheists are claiming, well, I know I'm not worried about my approaching death because whereas in fact they are, and then the Christians are saying, well, I have sure and certain knowledge of my reward in heaven, whereas in fact they have exactly the same fears as the atheist in their hearts, as it were. As I say, this practical argument, perhaps this rather cynical argument, would be convincing to me on a practical level, if not for the fact that I suspect that actually religious people aren't untroubled by doubts. I'm sure there are some, but I suspect that the religious people that are untroubled by doubts, if they were atheists, they'd be untroubled by death as well. I suspect that it's a different thing. The promise that religion will take that stress or fear or whatever away from you, I suspect is false. I suspect that the religious, as a body anyway, have exactly the same doubts that the atheist has, and that the difference is that atheists sort of admit what they believe, whereas the religious, as it were, don't admit to themselves what they believe. And they treat their hopes as if they were their beliefs, and they claim, in fact, to believe what, in fact, they only hope. And so I don't think that religion can relieve people of the fear of death, at least for fairly educated people in the developed world in the 21st century. I mean, I think if I lived in the Middle Ages, I probably would hear people talk about heaven and life after death as a thing that was unproblematically true all the time. And I think that if I lived in an undeveloped country, and if I wasn't in the privileged minority that had access to sort of modern education, again, I would probably expect to hear people talk about life after death as a thing which was settled fact all the time. I'm talking specifically about sort of roughly educated people in the developed world. For us, I think that the promise of religion that it can take away the fear of death is probably false.